Thank you, Hitesh, for setting the scene for this morning. Very good. And yes, it's important to understand you make a lot more money with stolen legal drugs than from illegal drugs. So there was a reason for serialization. But without wasting any time from my side, I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Samantha Atkinson, who is talking to us about QMM, a natural development of pharma regulation. Please.
Thank you so much, and thanks very much for the invitation to come and speak today. It's a real pleasure to be here, actually, and hopefully this doesn't work. You're saying?
It does now.
It does now. Okay, that's helpful. I'm hoping it will. Hey, okay, fine. So just to give you a very quick background, I'm Sam Atkinson, so I worked at the MHRA for around 16 and a half years, something like that. I started as an inspector and then worked my way through up to the Chief Quality and Access Officer. So a lot of experience over the years in terms of working with industry and other regulators around the globe. I now work at NSF. I'm an Executive Vice President, and we do an awful lot of consultancy work, obviously, and a lot of other things. It's a global organisation, and we do everything from remediation, audits, training, mock inspections, for example, and indeed we do things like certification of food and water. We have a huge number of independent consultants and permanent staff around the globe, and indeed have a really global footprint, which enables us both to work around the globe with the sector and provide both technical, the cultural support, but also enable support in a financially efficient way, should we say. So today, and I will try and catch us up a little bit on time, and we'll see where we get to. I wanted to talk a bit about sort of the regulatory evolution, and we've talked about this over the years, and certainly in the time that I was in the regulator, this was obviously a hot topic and something that we wanted to see evolve. And I think what I can say is over the period of time that I've worked in the sector, we've seen the same issues over and over again, and I think we can see that, and I'll show you some data shortly, that actually, you know, it's the same deficiencies, it's the same errors or challenges in our quality management system. And that's perhaps because we focus very much on tracking rather than perhaps preventing. And that's a little bit through regulatory evolution, actually, and the drive from regulators to some degree. I'm allowed to say that now, I'm not a regulator. So, you know, we do follow what the regulations and the regulators require, and we do put in place additional steps, additional approvals. But that has to some degree also pushed us down the line of being a little bit reactive rather than proactive. So today I just want to talk a little bit about where we've been, some trends going forwards, including Pharma 4, which I'll touch on very briefly, and then just some new approaches in terms of quality management maturity. So, as I say, the data is pretty clear, it's pretty stark. This is FDA data, and as you can see, it really does demonstrate that we're still seeing issues in 2021 and 2022 in the same areas of our quality system, so records and reports, lab controls, etc. We do see this year on year, and I think the other thing that I've noted over the years is that the sector very much responds to the deficiency rather than the intent or the spirit of that deficiency. They're not looking broader at, and we talk about root cause, but actually it's almost broader than that. It's thinking about how does this impact your quality system? Is there something similar? Are there risks elsewhere? Rather than, as we quite often see, just the deficiency being responded to. And I think there's something else with our sector which I think we really must understand, and that's that it's quite difficult to share information because no one really wants to communicate quality failures. Why would you? It's airing your dirty laundry, as they would say. But that does present challenges. If you think of other sectors like aviation or nuclear, for example, they're in a much better position because they're able to actually have those sensible conversations about where there are real challenges, so that as a sector, we take that collective accountability. I think we also, as a sector, try and alleviate or eliminate risk by adding complexity, and again, probably a little bit of a driver from the regulators, add extra steps, add extra approvals, add extra checks, and maybe the time has come that we need to think about something different. And just in terms of MHRA data, just to add to the FDA data, the MHRA haven't actually published anything since 2019, and that's not because I left, by the way. It is, I think, just because they're actually quite short-staffed now, and these sorts of things take time. But the top two, you can see there, root cause analysis, deviations, not fully recorded, investigated, the same sorts of things as we always see. And there is a question, again, whether we spend too much time on considering how quickly we can get things to market, that speed to market, rather than the quality and mass production. So quite a different mindset. And we focus a lot on process. So the trends really do show that we need to move forward and move to something a bit different, and move away from perhaps the traditional approach. We need to consider perhaps active leadership in prevention, employee experience, not engagement. I'll come on to explain more about that. Cooperation and collaboration, again, these are initiatives that are coming through really to lead us through to sustained quality systems that really do give us that quality culture we're looking for, that reduces things like deviations and compliance issues, but also manages supply disruptions, and importantly for the sector, keeps the costs down, and I'll talk a bit more about that too. So what we have here is obviously a number of initiatives that have come through, and they have been influenced by the past. And that could be because we're very much operating in much more of a patient-centric way. It could be actually the negative inspections that we've seen in terms of compliance issues or negative outcomes, and that costs money. And we'll talk again a bit more about that. Could be that there's culture change. I mean, even in society, EDI is much, much more prevalent these days, and it's much more visible and talked about. That drive to change culture across the organisations that we work in. It could indeed be that we require greater levels of oversight, being that we're more and more global, we've got more digitisation, as Hitesh was talking about, or it could be that we would just want to do the right thing. But most likely, it's probably a bit of all of it. So let me just take you back and see whether anyone remembers some of these headlines. So the regulatory action, the top left there. This one, the product recall. This was Pharma. Anyone remember this? 2003. I see a smile in the audience. There we go. So TGA suspended licenses to manufacture for 6 months for Pharma, and that this was due to concerns of quality and safety of products. Mainly there were failures both in the manufacturing and the quality control. It was very widespread, it was systemic, it was deliberate manipulation of QC data. The result of this action meant that 219 products were recalled immediately, and 1,650 or thereabouts products that were exported, their approvals were cancelled. So huge impact financially to that organisation, huge impact to the patient, and importantly as well, a huge financial hit for that organisation. In 2013, the bottom left, we see that the US FDA came out with the news that they were going to be inspecting and considering CFR Part 11, which of course is all around electronic records. And again, this sort of starts to build a picture of this data integrity, the quality systems that we have in place, etc. The top right one, this is a UK-based one, it's actually a GLP case where an individual was jailed for 3 years in Scotland. He was manipulating data sets which were going to be used for clinical decisions, or decisions for clinical trials, should I say. And this involved a huge number of studies, a massive investigation, and a very big regulatory and industry action in terms of that particular organisation had a large response to it. It had, again, a massive financial hit on them and on their bottom line, of course, and indeed on their reputation. But in this case, it also impacted the individual specifically. If you want to know more about that, I was actually the lead inspector and expert witness for that particular case. It's the first and only GLP prosecution we've had in the UK. The bottom right talks about data integrity, and this was following that case because it became apparent that actually this wasn't the only example, although not so severe in other cases, but there was certainly evidence that we had manipulation of data sets that needed to be considered. And all of these things lead through to, obviously, the impact on the patient, the supply disruption, as I've talked about, the reputational damage and the cost, but equally the regulatory burden. And that again, is an additional cost. I said I'd talk a little bit about cost. IQVIA, a competitor, perhaps I shouldn't mention, but they have issued a really interesting paper which talks around the cost of quality. And they say that for immature organisations, the cost of quality is anywhere between 25 and 40% of revenue, really quite a significant amount. For more mature and optimised or leading organisations, if you think about, across the range of maturity levels, at that top end, that cost of quality is 3 to 7% of revenue. So a really big difference if you can actually make that jump through your maturity level. And hence why there's so much going on around maturity. And indeed, I've seen recently a data integrity maturity assessment tool that's recently been published as well. So there's lots going on. Okay, so this was said at a conference fairly recently, actually. I think it was the MHRA's conference by Laura Squire. Compliance is a behaviour. Laura's my successor. Great individual, really on the ball in terms of the direction of travel of regulation. But she's not the only one that's spotting this sort of thing. McKinsey have also said quality must be managed not only with attention, but also with intention. Really, really driving towards the whole point around culture and people and the personal intervention that can actually happen in terms of quality systems. So if we look at then the roadmap of the trends that are coming through, we've obviously just had a very nice presentation from Hitesh on Pharma 4. And, this is the ISPE roadmap towards the smart factory, and we've had lots more detail. But if you think about the fundamentals, this is about embedding regulatory best practice. It's around really accelerating Pharma 4 integration and leveraging the potential of digitisation. It ensures faster innovations, improves production flows, but it also really benefits patients. I was really pleased actually to see that we do actually have culture incorporated into this particular activity or initiative. And it's also the leadership around that, and that is noted here as well in terms of that communication decision making. That's around the leadership element. And Pharma 4 actually have a really good leader in terms of Christian Volbeling, who actually is leading on this particular area. And I think that also demonstrates the need for a leader, whether you're putting through an initiative across the regulatory sector or the pharma sector, or indeed whether you're in an organisation trying to implement this. Another individual, Christopher Hodges, has also talked about outcome-based cooperative regulation. And this is slightly different. This is where all the actors together take that collective responsibility. And really it's about supporting people to behave well and consistently improve performance. It's also about sort of relying on that the intrinsic motivators with those supportive interventions, and not that sort of control and authoritarian kind of nature of organisations that can happen. It's around building trust through evidence, but also having the belief that people do the right thing. And it's around collaborative kind of co-creation, that sort of involving everyone. And this really encourages continuous improvement. It enables innovation again, like Pharma 4. It really does work on transforming productivity. It also provides a really ethical and fair workspace, and I think that's also quite important when we start thinking about culture. And a collaborative approach. And I looked a little bit deeper into this and found that actually there's a number of other regulators in different sectors that are also working around this cooperative based approach to regulation. So you'll see here that the Safe Food for Canadian, I can't read it on my own thing, regulations, they're actually working on this. And so are the Financial Conduct Authority. And this is all around that motivational empowerment kind of situation that we're really putting in place. Hitesh mentioned earlier about innovation outpacing regulation. And my challenge, not to Hitesh perhaps, but to everyone, is whose responsibility is that? If we think about cooperative-based regulation, actually it's around everyone getting together and working out what needs to be done to actually get the right outcome. And that's because we're thinking about those outcome-based cooperative regulation to really drive forward success. And the industry partners that I've worked with over the years, whether at the MHRA or now at NSF, the ones that are really driving forward in innovation are the ones that are prepared to have those conversations. So, you know, take something from that. In terms of other areas of initiatives, we've also got ISPE's Cultural Excellence, which obviously has been out for a while. This is very much designed around advancing pharmaceutical quality and designed to assess and enhance the maturity of a quality system. And much like many of the initiatives that are out at the moment, it's very much based on ICH Q10. It really does integrate sort of that maturity element along with culture and the operational excellence principles, really driving forward things like continuous improvement, that general ownership, that sort of overall ownership of quality, effective and efficient use of resource, also benchmarking, which some of the other initiatives don't have, and knowledge sharing. Again, we talked about how do you share your quality failures. I think the other thing with the ISPE Cultural Excellence element is that it has a number of dimensions, these 6 dimensions, which really do play to this in terms of being able to influence and change your organisation. And these dimensions really are around leadership and vision, attitude, mindset, employee engagement, leading quality indicators, so again, those KPIs, proactive oversight and cultural enablers. So there is some thinking around how we really pull in the cultural elements into improving the maturity of our quality systems. It's very much a self-assessment, self-improvement tool, and you know it has got a lot of traction and a lot of support, I think. But furthermore, we also have something else which CIPD's quality culture as well. They talk about climates. I don't know if anyone's heard of climates as opposed to culture, but everyone knows culture as your workplace norms, your values, your behaviours, your traditions, you know, things that people can sort of understand. Climate's a little bit different, but I think everyone will respond to this quite well. It's how a place feels, the atmosphere. It's what you take away from it, what you attach yourself to in terms of that organisation. And what's interesting with this is that there are a number of dimensions within this, so safety, innovation, learning, etc. And you can take direct action against those different dimensions, which really does enable you to influence that quality system. And by selecting particular drivers that influence those dimensions, you can really start to change culture. So drivers such as leadership, team dynamics, job design, policies and procedures can be the drivers for change in those particular areas or those dimensions within a climate. So take leadership, for example. We've all been in an organisation, I'm sure, where a leader doesn't particularly like change. Well, you certainly don't see much innovation in that particular organisation, whereas somebody who is very pro-change, pro-innovation, really creative, really dynamic, you see that coming through in the organisation. And that's where a leadership driver can start changing those dimensions and therefore the climate of an organisation. So how do we sustain really good, mature quality systems? Well, it's always going to be a bit of a tricky one here, but there's definitely rewards if you're able to achieve this, because the regulatory burden generally would be reduced and the frequency of any inspection, for example. I think there's something around focusing on continuous improvement, business continuity, but also early detection of supply issues, really that proactivity. I also am a really big fan of something called Galbraith's STAR. It's a theory which aligns strategy, structure, process, people and rewards. And if you align all of those elements of your organisation's operations in a really positive way, you actually start to change behaviours and therefore culture. And I think if you fundamentally look at your organisation on an ongoing basis and ensure alignment to your strategy and structure, etc., you will ensure that you have that continued improvement of your quality system. Take, for example, a strategy or that is very much around ensuring the quality of products going to the patient. If you have reward systems that basically reward high levels of production and not high levels of quality production, you'll get a very different outcome and very different behaviours. So another way to consider maturity position is, of course, QMM. And one of the things that NSF have been focusing on very heavily, and we have a white paper if you want to come to booth M2, I can provide a copy of that. But basically, we've developed this based on the FDA's model of QMM. And I would say that, you know, a lot of people have said, well, what's the difference to ISP's cultural excellence approach? And there are differences, if you ask me. I think there are big differences. Firstly, the QMM was originated by the FDA, which means you've automatically got something which aligns to a regulatory approach. I'm not saying ISPE isn't endorsed by regulators, it indeed is, but it's still very helpful if you've got something that is still being actively worked on, consulted on, and being delivered as part of their inspection regime going forwards. I think it also delivers on other areas. So it looks at the cost of quality. It also can deliver or look at delivery performance, sorry. And I think all of these additional elements are quite important, and it takes that holistic view of all of the different areas of the quality system, the manufacturing design, supplier oversight, demand forecasting, and importantly, behaviours or culture. So, you know, why QMM? It says quite clearly here, and as I've just described, it is absolutely in line with the regulatory position at the moment. It's very proactive in terms of really driving forward continuous improvement. And it's not an audit or an inspection, it's different. It's looking at the robustness and the effectiveness of your quality system. But importantly, like I said before, it looks at the culture. It's hugely versatile, and it can be very much tailored to the needs. So whether that's remediation, whether it's as a health check or just being proactive in terms of really wanting to drive forward an improvement. So where did it come from? Well, you'll probably be aware of the 2019 drug shortages report, which described 62% of drugs in shortage between 2013 and 17 came from manufacturing or product quality issues. So FDA have very much driven a rating system which really thinks about how you incentivize greater levels of maturity, therefore compliance, therefore reducing shortages, and indeed reducing that regulatory burden and cost. So that's where it's all come from. And this is the model that's been used really to design and move forward from the old transactional approach to something which is much more all-encompassing, taking the strategic, tactical and operational approach that really does have that the culture and the people as part of that whole system. The process for the assessment obviously will vary depending on who's doing it, but I can guarantee that NSF's is particularly effective. We have used it quite widely around with global pharmaceutical organisations who have found it incredibly helpful. And we work with an organisation, which is very much the point of this QMM model, to really identify, tailor, and ensure that the roadmap of recommendations to maturity is actually clearly defined as an output to ensure the outcomes that we're trying to achieve are actually achieved. So in using the QMM model, I think there's a couple of things to note. Organisations in a low level of maturity generally have quite a lot of unplanned work or rework. They have out-of-date procedures or procedures not being followed, for example. There's no continuous improvement or very little innovation. There's little drive for that. It's very, very reactive. And staff are not engaged, and therefore there's a much higher attrition rate. But when we see organisations transition through those levels of maturity, we see that actually all of that's reversed. And we see best practice put in place, and organisations really dynamic. And staff are engaged because it's not about employee engagement, it's about employee experience, which drives higher levels of performance across the organisation. There's trust, transparency, inclusivity, innovation and learning that's really visible to see. It comes back to that climate. You walk into an organisation, you can feel it. And that's the difference between the two organisations. And there's the graduations between, of course, which QMM can help you take that stepwise approach and even focus in on specific areas that an organisation wants to really prioritise in order to perhaps meet their own objectives or regulatory requirements. So it's a fantastic tool to really take an organisation forward. Obviously, there's a report and everything else that you can actually have at the end of that assessment. But I think what's interesting is really thinking about what initiatives can really catapult organisations through those maturity levels. We heard quite a lot about digitalisation, of course, integration, automation. Of course, these things are going to help, but they are costly to some degree. But that's important as well. There is a level of investment that, of course, is required. Now, whether that's in time in terms of transforming the organisation or in actual digital or other solutions, obviously they're important. Data equally is important because that drives decision-making and enables you to get a really firm view of what's happening in the organisation and giving you that business intelligence. So, benefits. I think I've gone on quite a lot about the benefits, but I will just rattle through these a little bit. It is very much regulatory thinking. It does look at the robustness and effectiveness. It's a completely different mindset, and we educate both the organisations and indeed our consultants before they go out to do this, because it's not an audit, it's not an inspection. We don't ignore compliance. But that's not the primary focus. The focus is on robustness and effectiveness of the quality system and the interplay with the culture within the organisation and how you drive those outcomes and performance delivery metrics. It does obviously drive through greater levels of proactivity, especially around continuous improvement, sustainable compliance, etc. It does lead to an organisation being much more resilient. It leads to, hopefully, far less compliance issues and less supply issues and disruptions, which obviously at the end of the day is good for the patient. But equally, remember that 3 to 7% of revenue for cost of quality, if you're the most mature leading organisation, leads to bottom line changes. It also leads to that reputation being enhanced. Seeing as a top dollar organisation that really can drive this forward. I'm aware I'm almost out of time. I do have one case study. I will reiterate, I have these, this case study and indeed a white paper associated to QMM on booth M2. So I'm not necessarily going to go through the case study now, but I'm very happy to talk through that if anyone wants to come and have a chat about it afterwards. And I believe these slides are shared as well. But I will just leave you with, hopefully, a final thought. Obviously, it is all around individuals and organisations taking control and the leadership that's in that organisation. Industry 5.0 was also mentioned in the last presentation, and I find this quite interesting. It is very value of humans, you know, that's the driver. How do we incorporate that value and the innovation that comes from that? The one thing that Pharma 5 I don't think fully embraces is perhaps that cultural element, and maybe by touching on the value of humans, that's really where where the touch point is. And I would strongly encourage anyone looking at Pharma 5 or Industry 5 to think about how that interplays with the cultural elements as well as the value that individuals can bring. Because I think all of these different initiatives that I've talked through today really bring something different. And what we've tried to do with QMM is actually pull that together into one place with the assessment that we've developed. But I will pause there and say thank you. And if there are any questions, I'm very happy to take them. Thank you.
Sam, thank you very much. Very interesting and not before its time. I used to work for a major pharmaceutical company about 10 years ago, 15 years ago. We wanted to outsource to a data company who came up with a 5-step maturity model. And what they said at the sort of tendering process, I'm sorry, major pharmaceutical company, you're not mature enough on our model for us to supply you. You've got to improve. So it's a reverse way of thinking. And is there a future expectation, therefore, that suppliers may refuse to supply because the contract giver or the user may not be mature enough to ethically manage, use their products? And would the regulators set a minimum bar below which a company has to have an official legal improvement program to continue supply?
I think it's a really interesting question, and one which I can actually have an opinion on now. I don't work at a regulator. So I think that the FDA is driving forward to QMM and the maturity model. I absolutely think there's going to be an incentivised programme which will include more or less regulation and oversight by the regulators. And when one starts, all of the other regulators will most likely follow. And I do think that it's possible that you will see actors within the supply chain refusing to work with others if they don't have that level of compliance. I would say actually it's broader than regulation though, and it's not just about quality systems. I think we're starting to see even this in terms of sustainability and carbon footprint and all of that sort of thing. So, you know, I think it's broader, and that to me is a bit about societal change as well.
You make a very interesting point about there has to be a return on investment for companies, and regulators therefore offer more incentive because you've been able to demonstrate a maturity, which then reduces inspection or such like. I think that, you know, that's the only way. It's a classic behavioural change model, isn't it?
Exactly, and I think that's where they need to take their responsibility too. I mean, when we talk about that cooperative-based regulation, regulators have a role in that too. And actually what they're starting to do now, which is, I think, very positive, and we were doing it when I was still at the MHRA, is actually having live-streamed agency board meetings. And the reason for that is partly to give that level of transparency, but that is forming part of that trust between all of the actors within that regulated environment. So, you know, all of these elements are really important. There has to be a give and take for all the different parties.
Just to add, I know of suppliers, especially of computerized systems, who refuse certain customers their systems because, yes, they have no idea what CSV is, what GAMP is, or anything.
A little bit concerning.
No, thank you, Sam, for a great presentation. Just to close out on that, it's scope 1, scope 2 for supply chain pieces that third parties won't, and the scope 3 is how you're going to, you know, there's culture eats strategy for breakfast. The point on regulation outpacing, in 2015, I was at DigiPharma, and there was a type 1 diabetic individual who was presenting, and they crowdfunded their own solution because pharma or the industry weren't responding. So that was just to, you know, give you an example. And someone from AstraZeneca asked that person a question about, well, what do the regulators think? And he goes, well, no one's actually had an adverse reaction or event associated with our technology. So they had a patch Bluetooth-enabled app that monitored their blood sugar. They crowdfunded and sourced it and done that. The AstraZeneca person who asked the question, his response was, well, no one's died using our product, so therefore, you know, they're not going to be interested in what we're doing. but they found the solution to their problem.
Right.
Yeah, it was interesting.
Thanks. Maybe just an anecdote about perhaps how immature we are as a quality culture within pharma. Within nuclear energy, which I've had the opportunity to consult for before, the supply chain obligations on compliance are bidirectional. If you're selling to a plant, you must assess them. There is a regulatory obligation on you to assess them. So in terms of that, you know, whole ecosystem approach to quality maturity, they are decades ahead of us. You know, so there is that out there that we're still not even considering getting to that point.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's a really interesting one. I mean, I've talked a little bit about the differences, even just in sharing information, you know, yeah.
Thank you very much, Samantha.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of the day.